The morning after my husband's funeral, his mother changed the locks on our front door. Not her house. Mine. The house Daniel and I had bought together. The house where we had raised 2 children. The house where I had spent 17 years building a life I believed was permanent. I found out when I came back from dropping my kids at school and my key wouldn't turn. I stood on the porch for a full minute thinking I had the wrong key. Then I looked through the front window and saw her. Patricia Cole. Sitting in my living room. In my chair. Drinking from my coffee mug. Like she had always lived there. Like I was the one who didn't belong. She looked up and saw me through the glass. She didn't get up. She didn't come to the door. She just looked at me with those flat gray eyes and took another slow sip of coffee. And I understood in that moment that the war I had been dreading for 17 years had finally arrived. And she had fired the first shot before I even knew we were fighting. Let me tell you about Patricia Cole. Because you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she did. Patricia had been a military wife for 31 years. She had followed her husband Colonel George Cole to 7 different bases across 4 countries. She had raised 3 children in temporary housing and government quarters and rented apartments in cities where she didn't speak the language. She had done all of this without complaint, without public acknowledgement, without any of the recognition that was lavished on her husband while she quietly held everything together behind him. I understood all of that. I respected it deeply. What I could not accommodate was the conclusion she had drawn from it. The conclusion that her sacrifice entitled her to ownership of her husband's career, of her children's lives, of everything that came after, of me. I met Daniel Cole when I was 26. He was 30, a captain at the time, stationed at Fort Bragg. We met at a friend's wedding in Raleigh and spent most of the reception in the corner talking about everything except the military because I didn't know anything about it, and he seemed relieved to talk to someone who wasn't asking about his rank. He was funny in a quiet way. The kind of funny that sneaks up on you. He'd say something completely deadpan and then watch to see if you caught it, and when you did his whole face would change. I caught most of them. He seemed to like that. We were married 14 months later. Small ceremony. His family. Mine. 24 friends. Lunch afterward at a restaurant with a private room and a playlist we spent 3 weeks arguing about. It was perfect. Or it was perfect except for one thing. The look on Patricia Cole's face when Daniel said his vows. It was not the look of a mother watching her son commit to someone he loved. It was the look of a woman watching something she considered hers being handed to someone else. I saw it. I filed it away. I told myself I was imagining things. I was not imagining things. 17 years of marriage to Daniel Cole taught me many things. It taught me how to pack a house in 72 hours. It taught me how to make friends quickly and say goodbye without falling apart. It taught me how to be a mother largely alone because the person who was supposed to be doing it with me was frequently somewhere I couldn't follow. It taught me resilience in the specific way that military life teaches resilience. Which is to say it didn't give you a choice. You either adapted or you didn't. I adapted. What 17 years also taught me was the precise shape of Patricia Cole's disapproval. She never raised her voice at me. She was too composed for that. Too strategic. Her method was subtler and in many ways more effective. She undermined with questions. Are you sure that's how you want to handle that, Claire? She diminished with comparisons. When Daniel was young, I always made sure to. She excluded with history. You wouldn't understand, you didn't grow up in this life. Every holiday, every family gathering, every phone call that was supposed to be between me and my husband, but that she somehow inserted herself into. 17 years of small, precise cuts. None of them deep enough to bleed visibly. All of them accumulating into something that required constant internal maintenance to keep from becoming bitterness. Daniel knew. He was not oblivious. He tried in the imperfect way that men try when they love both the woman they married and the mother who raised them and cannot fully reconcile the two. He talked to her. She would soften briefly, then return to exactly what she had always been. I stayed because I loved him, because our life was real and good underneath the interference, because I had decided that Patricia Cole was a price I was willing to pay. I paid it for 17 years. And then Daniel died. And the price went up in a way I had not calculated. Colonel Daniel Cole died on a Wednesday in March. He was 51 years old. He had retired from active duty 2 years earlier after a knee surgery that complicated into something more serious than expected. He was healthy otherwise. Or we thought he was. The aneurysm gave no warning. He was sitting at the kitchen table reading something on his laptop. I was upstairs. I heard a sound I still cannot describe accurately. By the time I got downstairs, he was gone. Our son was at school. Our daughter was at her friend's house. I called 911. Then I sat on the kitchen floor next to my husband and held his hand until they arrived. Patricia arrived at our house 4 hours later. She had driven 3 hours from Fayetteville. She walked through my front door and went directly to the kitchen where the paramedics had been. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned to me with dry eyes and said the first thing she said to me after her son died. "We need to talk about the arrangements. Not I'm sorry. Not how are you. Not where are the children. We need to talk about the arrangements." And I understood in that moment that however hard the previous 17 years had been, they had only been the prelude. The funeral arrangements became the first battlefield. Patricia had opinions about everything. The venue. The order of service. Who spoke. What was said. She referred to herself to the funeral director as the family representative. She CC'd herself on emails that were addressed to me. She called Daniel's former commanding officers directly without telling me. She arranged a military honor guard without consulting me. I want to be clear. Some of those things were appropriate. She was his mother. She had a right to be involved. What she did not have a right to do was treat me like a guest at my own husband's funeral. When I raised it, quietly, privately, in the kitchen of my own house, she looked at me with those gray eyes and said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "Daniel was a Cole before he was yours. He will be remembered as a Cole." I looked at her for a long moment. He was also my husband for 17 years and the father of my children. She smiled the smile that had no warmth in it. "Yes," she said. "And now he's gone. And we'll see what that leaves you with, won't we?" I didn't understand what she meant until the morning after the funeral, when I came home and found my key wouldn't turn. She had called a locksmith the previous evening. While I was at the reception after the burial, surrounded by people offering condolences, she had called a locksmith and had every lock in my house changed. She had also, I would learn in the following days, contacted Daniel's bank. Daniel's lawyer. Daniel's former commanding officer, who was the executor named in a will I had never seen. A will. I need to stop here. Because this is the part where I have to tell you something I am still ashamed of. I did not know there was a second will. Daniel and I had made wills together 8 years earlier. Standard. Everything to each other and then to our children. I had the document. I had signed it. What I did not know was that 3 years ago, during a period when our marriage was under significant strain I won't detail here because it belongs to us and not to this story, Daniel had gone to a different lawyer. Alone. And made changes. Changes that I believe he intended to reverse. Changes that he died before reversing. Changes that Patricia Cole had known about. And had been waiting. Patiently. Strategically. For the right moment to use. The second will left the house to Daniel's estate rather than directly to me. It named Patricia Cole as the estate administrator. It made provisions for his pension and military benefits that were ambiguous enough to be contested. Patricia's lawyer, she had retained one before Daniel was buried, which tells you everything you need to know, argued that as estate administrator, she had the right to take possession of the primary asset immediately. The primary asset was our home. My home. Where my children lived. Where my son had a periodic table poster on his bedroom wall and my daughter had painted her room a color called Dusty Rose, and I had a coffee mug with a chip in the handle that I refused to throw away because Daniel had given it to me on our first anniversary as a joke and then apologized for it, and I had told him it was my favorite thing I owned. Patricia Cole wanted all of it. Not because she needed it. She had her own home. Her husband's pension. Security. She wanted it because she had decided that 17 years of being my husband's wife did not entitle me to what she considered the Cole family's assets. And she had a document that she believed gave her the power to take it. She was about to find out what happens when you underestimate a woman who has spent 17 years learning how to hold things together under pressure. I called a lawyer within 48 hours of finding the changed locks. Not just any lawyer. I had worked for 12 years as a paralegal before Daniel's career made that complicated. I knew what I needed. I found it. Her name was Susan Park. She was 53 years old. She had 30 years of experience in military family law specifically. She had a voice like a closed door and an expression that suggested she had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. She listened to everything I told her. She asked precise questions. She took notes. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me. "Mrs. Cole," she said, "your mother-in-law has made several significant errors." "What kind of errors?" "The kind that come from believing that possession is the same as ownership." She leaned forward slightly. "She changed the locks on a property she does not own. She contacted your husband's financial institutions without proper legal authority. She retained a lawyer before notifying you of the existence of a second will, which, depending on jurisdiction, may constitute a breach of fiduciary duty." She paused. "And she named herself estate administrator in a document that names her as a beneficiary, which creates an immediate conflict of interest that any competent judge will flag within 30 seconds. I looked at her. "Can we get my house back?" She almost smiled. "Mrs. Cole, we're going to do considerably more than that." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Daniel's death. 6 weeks during which Patricia's lawyer sent a series of letters that were clearly designed to intimidate. Letters about the validity of my marriage's financial arrangements. Letters questioning certain decisions I had made during the period of marital strain. Letters that were, in Susan Park's precise assessment, desperate. "They're throwing everything they can find," she told me. "That means they know the core case is weak." Is it weak? Her case is built on a document that was drafted under circumstances that can be challenged by a woman who named herself administrator of an estate she stands to benefit from, who has already demonstrated she's willing to abuse that position by changing locks on a property before any court has ruled on its status. She looked at me steadily. "Yes, her case is weak." I nodded. "What do I need to do?" "Show up," she said, "and let me do the rest." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had imagined something formal and imposing. It was just a room with a judge's bench and 2 tables and fluorescent lighting that was slightly too bright. Patricia was already seated when I arrived. She did not look at me. She was wearing a dark suit and her silver hair was pinned back, and she sat with the posture of a woman who had never once in her life taken up less space than she believed she was entitled to. Her lawyer was a man named Gerald Hurst. He was expensive-looking and confident in a way that I recognized as the confidence of someone who wins often enough to have forgotten what losing feels like. He was about to be reminded. The judge was the Honorable Catherine Morris. She was 61 years old. She had short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who had heard every variation of every argument and had long since run out of patience for the ones that wasted her time. She reviewed the documents for several minutes after the session opened. Nobody spoke. Then she looked up over her glasses. First at Gerald Hurst. Then at Susan Park. Then, briefly, at me. Then back to the documents. "Counsel," she said to Gerald Hurst. "I have a question about the appointment of Mrs. Patricia Cole as estate administrator." "Of course, Your Honor." "Your client is also named as a beneficiary in this will?" "She is, Your Honor. However, I'm not finished." The judge looked back at the document. "Your client appointed herself administrator of an estate from which she stands to personally benefit. The will explicitly names her. I understand what the will says, counsel." "I'm asking about the conflict of interest." A pause. "We believe the bequest is modest enough that I'll determine what's modest, thank you." Judge Morris set the document down. "I'm also looking at an affidavit here from a locksmith who states he was hired by your client to change the locks on a property on March 19th. She looked up. "Is that correct?" Gerald Hurst shifted slightly. "My client took steps to secure the property that no court had at that point assigned to her control. Given the uncertainty of the estate, there was no legal uncertainty on March 19th, counsel. There was an unvalidated will and a woman who had just buried her husband. Your client does not get to unilaterally take possession of property based on a document that has not been reviewed by this court. She looked at him steadily. Are we clear on that? A pause. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Morris made a note. Then she removed her glasses. I'm going to tell you what I see here, she said. She looked at both tables equally. I see a valid marriage of 17 years. I see a jointly occupied marital home. I see 2 minor children who live in that home. I see a will drafted under circumstances that this court will require significantly more information about before accepting as the final expression of the deceased's wishes. She paused. And I see an estate administrator who has already demonstrated a willingness to act outside her legal authority in ways that directly harmed the surviving spouse and children. Patricia Cole was very still. This court will not be validating the appointment of Patricia Cole as estate administrator, Judge Morris said. The conflict of interest is self-evident. This court will appoint an independent administrator. She looked at Patricia directly for the first time. Mrs. Cole, you will arrange for the locks to be restored to their prior state by the end of business today. You will return any property removed from the marital home. And you will cease contact with financial institutions connected to this estate until an independent administrator has been appointed and has had the opportunity to review all relevant documents. She put her glasses back on. This court will reconvene in 30 days to review the validity of the second will under appropriate scrutiny. In the meantime, the surviving spouse and children will remain in the marital home undisturbed. She looked at Gerald Hurst over her glasses one final time. Counsel, I'd encourage your client to spend the next 30 days considering whether the cost of continuing this action, financial, legal, and personal, is worth what she appears to believe she stands to gain. She stood. Everyone stood. And it was over. 37 minutes. 17 years of low-grade warfare. 37 minutes for a judge who had clearly seen this kind of thing before to look at what Patricia Cole had built and find it exactly as weak as Susan Park had told me it was. Patricia did not speak to me when we left the courtroom. She walked past me with her eyes forward and her posture unchanged. As if nothing had happened. As if a judge had not just methodically taken apart everything she had tried to construct. Gerald Hurst was quieter than he had been going in. Susan Park walked beside me and said nothing until we reached the parking lot. Then she stopped. You okay? Yes, I said. And I was. Not happy exactly. Not victorious. Those felt like the wrong words for what I was feeling. I was steady. I was standing in a parking lot outside a courtroom, and my husband was still dead, and my children still didn't have their father, and none of what had just happened changed any of that. But I was in my house. My children were in their house. And the woman who had spent 17 years trying to make me feel like I didn't belong had just been told clearly and finally by someone with the authority to make it stick that she was wrong. The second will was ultimately not validated. It took 4 months and significant legal fees and a deposition from Daniel's original lawyer, who testified that Daniel had spoken to him about reversing the changes. It was not easy. None of it was easy. But it was done. Patricia and I have not spoken since the day she walked past me in that parking lot. I don't know if we ever will. I have made my peace with that. What I have not made my peace with, what I suspect I never fully will, is the timing of it. The morning after my husband's funeral. Before I had even had a full day to begin understanding what his absence was going to mean. She had chosen that morning. Of all the mornings available to her, she had chosen that one. I think about that sometimes. What it must be like to be so consumed by wanting that you cannot allow a widow one full day before you begin trying to take what she has left. I don't feel angry about it anymore. I feel something quieter and sadder than anger. I feel sorry for her. Because I had 17 years with her son. 17 years of a real and complicated and deeply human love. And she spent all of it trying to take it apart. And in the end, she didn't. And now it's over. And all she has from those 17 years is a courtroom loss and an estrangement from her grandchildren and the memory of sitting in my chair drinking from my coffee mug the morning after her son's funeral. Believing she had won something. When really, she had only just begun to lose. My children are okay. That is the most important thing. My son still has his periodic table poster. My daughter's room is still dusty rose. My coffee mug with the chip in the handle is still in the cabinet where it has always been. Daniel is gone. Nothing changes that. Nothing in any courtroom changes that. But we are in our home. And we are together. And we are going to be okay. He would have wanted that. He would have wanted exactly that. And whatever his failures were, and he had them, as all of us do, I believe he knew, and we are going to be okay. He would have wanted that. He would have wanted exactly that. And whatever his failures were, and he had them, as all of us do, I believe he knew that. I believe he was sorry. I believe if he had known what was coming, he would have fixed it. I have to believe that. Because the alternative is a version of Daniel I don't recognize. And I lived with that man for 17 years. I knew who he was. He was worth 17 years. He was worth the fight. And so were my kids. And so was I.